Okay, so today is our second day of notes for the late Middle Ages, and we're covering two topics, the Inquisition and the Black Death. And that's the reason we gave this set of notes the title Dark Times in Medieval Europe. And you'll see that a lot of bad things are going to go on in today's notes. We're going to start today with the Reconquista or the Reconquest. It's also known as the Spanish Crusade. We talked about the Crusades last class. Those Crusades went to the Holy Land, where the Christian Crusaders tried to free it from Muslim control. In this case, Christians are going to turn to Spain and try to free it from Muslim control, which it had been under for centuries. The Muslims had created the Kingdom of Al-Andalus in Spain. 1063 CE was the start of the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain from the Moors. And remember, the Moors were the Spanish Muslims. By 1085, the Crusaders had recaptured Toledo, and by 1300, only Granada remained free from Spanish control, Granada being on the southern coast of Spain. And by 1492, Granada would fall and the Reconquista would be complete. Spain was now under Christian control once again. And if you look at the warm-up that we posted on Blackboard, you can see the phases of the Reconquista and how they slowly push south towards the Mediterranean Sea. 1492 was an important year for the Spanish because they completed the Reconquista, but also it was the year that they had financed Christopher Columbus's voyage in which he eventually would find the Americas, which would be very beneficial to the Spanish. So looking at this map, the Reconquista began in northern Spain, and these Christian crusaders would eventually push south towards the Mediterranean, and eventually they would push the Muslims out of Granada as well, taking the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula for themselves and putting it under Christian control. The Spanish peninsula had been divided into three kingdoms: Portugal, Castile, and Aragon. And in 1469, Spain was unified when King Ferdinand of Aragon married Queen Isabella of Castile, and they brought their two kingdoms together to make Spain. And this was the same Ferdinand and Isabella who financed the voyage of Christopher Columbus. And here we have portraits of our very happy, very lovely couple, Ferdinand and Isabella, who married to create Spain. This smaller map shows the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. When they combined to create Spain, they would incorporate Granada in 1492, and then Navarre to the north in 1512. Portugal over on the west coast would remain an independent kingdom, which it still is today. After retaking all of Spain, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella began what's known as the Grand Inquisition in Spain. The word Inquisition comes from inquire, which means to question. And their goal was to have a completely Catholic kingdom. They would also use church courts to investigate for heresy. A heretic is a person with beliefs different from that of the church. And suspects of heresy would be interrogated using torture. And these suspects would be forced to confess to crimes which they didn't commit. One of the problems with using torture is that you're undergoing such agonizing punishment that you're going to tell these investigators whatever they want to hear in order to get them to stop. And that includes telling on others whether they committed any crimes or not. So you would end up giving them a list of names. Both those who confessed to their crimes and those who denied them would be executed. Jews and Muslims would be forced to convert to Christianity or expelled from Spain. Many Jews would go on to the Middle East, which would hurt Spain economically because Jews and Muslims made up a prosperous merchant class, and they took their wealth with them. A total of 150,000 people left Spain during this time, and by 1492, most Jews and Muslims had been expelled from Spain. This is a picture of the Inquisition. It would be like going to church. We know that the suspects of heresy are the ones wearing these dunce caps. We've got one here on the stage, and then it looks like three more over off to the side. They were the ones who were being investigated. And throughout the testimony, we would have officials back here who are taking notes. Before you went on trial, you would actually be tortured first. And in this method of torture, we're using the wheel, and the wheel would slowly roast you, but not quick enough where you would die. And all the while, we've got our officials back here, and they're waiting for you to confess your crimes. This method of torture was called the rack, and the goal of the rack was to pull your limbs so tight that eventually you'd have your shoulders and knees and hips pop out of socket. All the while questioning you and trying to get you to confess to your crimes of heresy. On the left, we have the head crusher, which does exactly what its name implies. And over on the right, we have a chair with these spikes. And the goal of this chair was not to kill you, but it was to cause you so much pain and discomfort that you would eventually go ahead and confess your crimes and then implicate others for heresy as well. In this picture, this suspect is being waterboarded. We can see the water here. They would pour water over your face, in your mouth, and in your nose so that you felt like you were drowning. They would also burn you with these hot coals. All the while, our officials are writing down what's happening and what you are saying. Women heretics might be seen as witches, and they would be burned alive in public on the stake. In this picture, we've got our suspect being waterboarded again. We've got the hot coals, which have been used on his feet. And in the back, this man is also being tortured. His hands are pulled behind his back. There's a weight attached to his feet, and the goal is to pull his arms out of socket. All the while, our official is writing down everything that's going on. Another depiction of the rack is what we're looking at on this slide. This man is having hot coals placed on his feet in order to get a confession out of him. The Spanish thought that the Inquisition was such a great idea that they took it to Holland, also called the Netherlands. The Spanish monarchs had claims there, and they used this in the Netherlands as well. So we're going to move on from the Inquisition to the bubonic plague. And we've had a case of bubonic plague that we've talked about before. This was Justinian's plague in the Byzantine Empire. The bubonic plague got its name from the painful swellings called buboes on your lymph nodes, on your neck, your armpits, and your groin. And it also came to be known as the Black Death due to these black or purple buboes, these big knots that would turn color in those areas. It could also cause necrosis around your fingers. Necrosis is like when your skin can't get enough oxygen and it rots while it's still on your body. The plague would cause extremely high fever, heavy sweats, the chills, convulsive coughing, delirium, and death within 2 to 3 days, a lot of times from pneumonia when you would get fluid in your lungs. And the bubonic plague came from a bacteria, which came from rats and were transmitted to fleas and then to people. So this starts with rats. Rats eat just about anything. They are pretty dirty creatures. And because of that, they're going to end up carrying this disease. And rats will eventually get fleas, which live on them. When the flea bites the rat and takes in the rat's blood, the flea will now carry the bacteria. And then because rats at this time live so close to humans, eventually these fleas will jump on the humans and bite them. And like mosquitoes, when a flea bites you, it actually regurgitates a little bit into you. And in this case, it's regurgitating this bacteria into you before sucking your own blood and therefore making you an infected person. So here we can look at our chart. We have the flea, which drinks a rat's blood because the rat carries the bacteria. The bacteria would multiply in the flea's gut. The flea's gut is clogged with bacteria, and then the flea will bite a human, regurgitating the blood into the human wound, giving the human the bacteria and making the human infected. And over time, this bacteria would mutate and eventually it could be transferred human to human through things like saliva, so coughing and sneezing. So in these pictures, we've got the buboes. Okay, on your lymph nodes, we've got these giant purplish lumps. We see them on the groin as well. And we're also looking at necrosis, and this is why the Black Death got its name. So by the time the Black Death got done with you, this is what you would look like. And this is just a man wearing makeup, but you can see why it was called the Black Death. Now, today there are still cases of bubonic plague, but because it's a bacteria, we've developed antibiotics and we can actually fight against it successfully. Of course, the people of the Middle Ages had no idea what the cause of this Black Death was. So this is a depiction from the time period showing a man and woman with the lumps, and also in the back we've got a priest, and the priest is actually throwing potpourri, like flowers, up into the air because at this time they thought it was the smell that carried the disease from person to person. So many people were dying that they thought this was the devil and demons carrying out a plot to kill everyone on earth. The bubonic plague originated from the Gobi Desert of Mongolia, and as the Mongols expanded their empire, it would go on to China. Rats and their fleas would infest caravans, which would be traveling west along the trade routes. One of the things the Mongols did when they conquered their empire was create the Pax Mongolica, a time of peace and prosperity, and they allowed for trade across their empire all the way to Europe using the Silk Road. But that also made it easy for the plague to spread. It went through Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually Europe. It made it to Europe in 1347 when a fleet of Genoese trading ships landed in Sicily and they brought the disease to the ports and eventually into Europe. And if you are Genoese, it means you are an Italian from the city of Genoa. The plague would spread quickly throughout Europe within 4 years because of the unsanitary conditions that the Europeans lived in. And from Italy, it would move north and infect the rest of Europe. So looking at this map, we can see that the plague originated in Mongolia, around this area here. The Mongols would bring it into China, and from China, it's going to spread using the spice trade through the Indian Ocean, eventually reaching the Middle East. It would eventually reach North Africa, and it would also spread west through the Silk Road, heading towards the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, and eventually the Mediterranean Sea. So this disease was carried from traders from the east and eventually would spread to Europe by these Genoese sailors. Now, there's a city called Kaffa right here on the Black Sea, and it was put under siege by the Mongols. And one of the things the Mongols did to try to crush the spirit of the people living there was they would fling dead bodies of those who had died of the plague over the walls of the city. And it began to infect the people living there, including those sailors from Genoa. But they didn't know it, and they were able to escape on their boats. And those boats took them, along with the rats, back to Sicily. And they got off their boats. The rats also got off the boats and would eventually infect those around them. Sicily was known for its trade routes around it, and eventually traders would leave Sicily, heading to Genoa and Venice and Rome, and eventually from there it would spread to the rest of Europe. So the plague had come into Europe through Italy, and by 1351, all of Europe, for the most part, had been infected. Now we do see some of the blue areas on the map: Poland, parts of the Netherlands, and the city of Milan were spared from the disease. There were some deaths from the plague, but for the most part, the disease was softened, and that's because these areas either had sparse populations or their leaders shut off their borders and kept people out who might be carrying the plague. So thoughts of death surrounded everyone in Europe. They saw that life on Earth was fragile, and they end up personifying death as a skeleton or reaper. And we end up with a new artistic style that emerges from the bubonic plague called the Danse Macabre. And people would say that death unites all, whether you're young or old, rich or poor, a king or the lowliest serf. Everyone is at risk from catching the plague and dying. And we think that even Ring Around the Rosie, which you probably played with your friends growing up, could have been a folk song about the Black Death. Ring Around the Rosie means the ring around the bubos. Pocket full of posy. Posy would be like potpourri that you would put in your pocket that you'd bring up to your nose so that you wouldn't smell the scent of death. And of course, we all fall down. Everybody's dying. So here we have the Danse Macabre, the artistic style with skeletons who are having a party around this old man walking to his doom. Here the skeletons are all dancing around the grave of someone who has just died from the plague. And in this piece of artwork, there was actually a job where you would go around from town to town collecting the bodies of those who had died, because people were dying so fast they couldn't bury them on their own. In fact, so many people were dying and there was so little time to bury them that in Italy, they actually used one of the rivers and they consecrated it as a holy burial ground and just tossed the bodies in the river and let them wash away into the Mediterranean Sea. And another depiction of the Danse Macabre, the artistic style of the Middle Ages during the bubonic plague, with all the skeletons who are having a party. So the idea of the reaper comes from this time period. The reaper was a tool that was used in farming. You would knock down all of your stalks of wheat, and they would say that, well, so many people are dying, it's like the reaper is going around and knocking down people instead of stalks. So for many, they thought that this was the end of the world. This was hell on earth. And that's depicted in the artwork that they created during this time. There were attempts to stop the plague. One thing that infected people would do was use leeches to suck out your bad blood. They thought that that could help to cure you, and you needed a balance of good blood and bad blood. We also had the Flagellant Brothers, and these were Christians who would punish themselves by using whips, and they would whip their own backs to atone for the sins of humanity, punish themselves to save everyone else, and they were seeking God's forgiveness. We also have pogroms, and when Jews were blamed for bringing on the plague, Jews would be driven from their homes, and in many cases they would be massacred. So on our picture on the left, we've got a man wearing like a bird mask, and he would be considered a plague doctor. He would go around trying to help people. And the reason it looks like the mask of the face of a bird is they would put potpourri, scented flowers, inside of the beak in order for him to smell good air instead of the smell of death, because they thought it was the smell that transferred the disease from one person to another. And here we have them trying to cut the buboes to let out the bad blood in order to help people. and neither of these really worked. Here's a leech. If you've ever been out fishing in like a shallow river, you might get these on your legs and you can just pull them off, but they will suck your blood. And these were used to try to get rid of a person's bad blood to help them out. In this picture, we have the Flagellant Brotherhood marching through the streets. Again, they would whip themselves to show that they were sorry for the sins committed by humankind. This is a depiction of a pogrom. Again, the Jews were blamed even though they had nothing to do with this plague. And because they were isolated, it seemed like they were not catching the plague as much as other Europeans. And therefore, Europeans would go to these Jewish towns, and sometimes they would lock the gates and set the entire town or village on fire with the Jews living in them. None of these methods were able to slow down the plague, and the plague had a huge impact on Europe. There was a decline in population. Town populations fell by 2/3 to 3/4 in some places. And that meant there was a scarcity of labor. There weren't enough workers to go around. And this actually helped serfs who had survived the plague. It gave them the opportunity to leave the manor in search of better wages. They could go work for a lord who would take care of them better than their old lord. During this time, trade will decline. People are dying, so we have less merchants, and prices are also going to rise. We see towns being freed from feudal obligations. The lords are not able to control their towns because they're afraid of catching this plague. Or if they die, well, there's no one really to look over the town, and towns would be freed. Just like with the Crusades, we also see a decline in the influence of the church over the people of Europe. Prayer had failed to halt the spread of the plague. And priests would abandon their duties. They were looking out for themselves and trying to make sure that they survived. And just like what we talked about with the Crusades, the Black Death will help to break down the feudal system of Europe. And you're going to see the same thing in the next two classes of notes, the breakdown of the feudal system. Now, our reading review is going to be a little bit different for this set of notes. Instead, we have a different reading, not from the book, that will be posted on Blackboard, and we'll make sure we have directions of how to get to that and how to answer the questions.